the Democratic leader.
I ask consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 15 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, they did it in a closed room. No one in the public was allowed to watch. They did it by a voice vote so that there would be no physical record of individual congressmen and how they voted. And they decided to remove a member of the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives this morning in that fashion. These proud, courageous disciples of Donald Trump didn't want to be on the record publicly as to where they stood on the fate of Congresswoman Cheney. This is the same Congresswoman Cheney who was reelected to leadership in the House just a few weeks ago. This is the same Congresswoman Cheney who is one of the most ideologically conservative members of the House. She voted with President Trump nearly 93% of the time while she was in office. And with a name like Cheney, it's hard to question her Republican credentials. No, the decision in private, in secret this morning, by a voice vote, was about not a disagreement over policy, but the issue as to whether or not Liz Cheney dares to tell the truth. She refused to defend or ignore the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. And in today's Republican parties, it seems like that is all that's necessary for grounds for removal. More than 6 months after the 2020 election was held, it's clear that the big lie has been spread in a big way. And that lie is not just a threat to the future of the Republican Party, it's a threat to our democracy. Since the start of this year, Republican state legislatures, inspired by Donald Trump's big lie that the election was stolen, have introduced more than 360 bills with restrictive voting provisions in 47 states. One of the most notorious examples, the state of Georgia. Remember the state of Georgia, hotly contested in the 2020 election. And then the Trump troops came in and went to court over and over and over again, suggesting there was election fraud and dishonesty in the Georgia election. And the Georgia election officials, virtually all Republicans, stood up and said it was an honest election. A close one, but it was an honest election. They were challenged over and over again to the point where the former president of the United States, while he was still in power, called an election official in Georgia and basically threatened him that if he didn't change the votes and give President Trump what he thought he needed to win, he would pay a price for it. It went that far. To his credit, this election official stood up and said, the results are accurate and I stand by them and I'm not going to change them. It went that far. And there was a big turnout in Georgia. In fact, there was an amazing turnout in the runoff election for the 2 U.S. Senate seats, won by John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, our colleagues here in the United States Senate. So even with that big turnout, and even with the certainty that that election was honest from start to finish, the Georgia legislature decided to change the laws for voting in Georgia. It wasn't volume they were looking for, it was loyalty. They wanted to make sure that the voters in the future would be friendlier to the Republicans. And so they changed the Georgia election law and made it harder for people, particularly people of color, young people, the elderly, people of limited means to vote. That Georgia voting law represents a blatantly political effort to subvert our democratic process. Republicans of conscience know this, but it seems there's no future for those Republicans if we reflect on the vote taken this morning in the House of Representatives Republican caucus. Liz Cheney's expulsion from her role in the Republican conference is just the latest example of what happens to Republican officials who dare to speak truth about the 2020 election. They're not only silenced, they're purged from the party ranks. Our own colleague, Senator Mitt Romney, not long ago a Republican candidate for president of the United States, was just censured by a Republican county organization in his state because he refuses to support the big lie of Donald Trump. The unfortunate reality is that today the loudest voices within the Republican Party have joined Donald Trump in declaring war on the basics of our democracy. That's why we in Congress need to do something immediately. This week, the Rules Committees held a hearing on a measure that will combat voter suppression and protect our democratic process. It's known as the For the People Act. This is a democracy defense plan. It will ensure that all eligible Americans can exercise their constitutional right to vote without facing burdensome barriers at the ballot box. The For the People Act invests in election infrastructure, provides state and local officials with resources to run safe, secure elections. In addition to combating voter suppression, the bill also reforms a broken campaign finance system that gives wealthy donors and big corporations far too much influence on our electoral process. By passing it, we will say loud and clear that America's elections are not for sale to the highest bidder. Above all, this legislation will strengthen the integrity of our democratic process, put more power in the hands of the people. Now, I know some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been attacking the bill as a, quote, takeover of the nation's election system. The truth is, American elections have already been taken over by special interest. This bill will start to restore our democracy and make it more accessible to every eligible American. I would love to know why my Republican colleagues find it so objectionable about the legislation's core provisions. Listen, it automatically registers American voters when they get a driver's license, guarantees at least 15 days of early voting, ending partisan gerrymandering nationwide, bringing greater transparency to campaign finances. These are reforms that will make our democracy whole again, and they are desperately needed, particularly at this moment in our history. Because in the world's greatest democracy, people shouldn't have to wait in line for hours on end to have their voices heard. And yet, that's the reality for voters in states just like Georgia. And it's not an accident. It's intentional. Look at the people standing in the lines, and you can understand why they are being discouraged from voting by waiting so long. Let's be honest about these restrictive voting provisions being passed in state legislatures across the country, because they're grounded in one lie after another. The truth is that President Trump's own officials at the Department of Homeland Security declared the 2020 election was the most secure election in American history. The truth is, judges across the country, including many appointed by President Donald Trump, threw out more than 63 lawsuits that his followers filed challenging the results of last year's elections. Why? There was no evidence, no basis in fact for the big lie. But the truth is, the big lie won't just die with the 2020 election. It will sow distrust in our electoral system for years to come, unless my Republican colleagues act with courage. A few have done so. This morning, one paid a heavy price. The question to all of us is, are we prepared to either discredit democracy or defend it? Rejecting the big lie is the defense of our democratic process. We have to join together in making certain that every American's right to vote is protected. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.